Hi, this is Matthew Schmitz, Deputy Editor of First Things Magazine, uh, and I'm here talking to
Barbara McClay, Associate Editor at the Hedgehog Review.
Barbara. How are you?
Good, how are you?
Good, good. I feel it's worth saying for those who don't know that Barbara and I are former colleagues. You worked here at First Things maybe, a year ago or so,
Yeah.
and have since moved on to the Hedgehog Review. Tell us a bit about the review for those who aren't familiar with it.
Yeah, the Hedgehog Review is a journal of ideas that comes out 3 times a year. Each issue has a theme. So the past two themes have been poverty and privacy, and the upcoming theme is the body. And we're
The
published.
body.
The body, yeah. It's going to have, let's see, going to be an essay about transhumanists, an essay about boxing, meditation from Mark Edmondson, and we're associated with a research facility, I guess, called the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture, which is associated with UVA. So we're not a UVA publication, but we abide by UVA's rules. And yeah, the upcoming issue I think is coming out July 1st. So if you subscribe now, you'll get it. Then I do advertising for this. And First Things obviously is a publication that needs no introduction.
Right. It's been around maybe a little bit longer. Anyway, Barbara, we were thinking of discussing trigger warnings a bit. Do we need to offer any preliminary trigger warnings before beginning our conversation?
No, I don't think so. But yeah, it's kind of weird. This time last year, trigger warnings were in the news, and so then it left the news cycle. And then it was like I woke up one morning and we had time traveled back to May 2014, as if we're just going to live through this particular controversy over and over again. But yeah, I guess a brief definition of trigger warnings for people who aren't familiar with them, sort of something that I think grew out of blogs, basically, where if you were writing about a sensitive or upsetting topic, you put like a trigger warning or a content warning at the top. It's like trigger warning, suicidal ideation or something. And then the idea is that if somebody is just casually browsing the web and they run across this, then they know to skip it. They don't want to deal with that. But now, I guess people who have sort of grown up in this online atmosphere want them in the classroom, which has become very controversial. So I'm not even quite sure what started off the May 2015 round. Oh, it was the Columbia people, wasn't it? The Columbia letter about
I don't know. What was this
Ovid.
letter?
I think I'm trying to find it. Some students wrote to the Columbia student newspaper saying that Ovid needs a trigger warning. I think this was it. And that kicked it off. So,
Right.
yeah.
Trigger warning. So I feel like the kind of phenomenon of trigger warnings, it reminds me of a couple things. I think probably a lot of people have discussed there's similarity to spoiler alerts. Obviously there's a very different function. Trigger warn. In those. I mean, they're both alerts to kind of information that is to follow, but it's serving very different functions. One is preserving your enjoyment and experience as a viewer of something. and the other is trying to prevent you from having a, if not exactly traumatic, then at least a very unpleasant experience.
Mm-hmm.
But I think another parallel, um, I work at, I kind of grew up in an evangelical Christian environment where there's a great alertness to the possibility that one's mental purity could be compromised by exposure to something that is you know tempting or distracting. And while this is different in many ways from what's going on with trigger warnings, it shares a strong conviction that um, things you read or things you see can have a powerful effect on you, and a dangerous effect, and that there are obligations attendant on those presenting information to make warning when something might become what Christians might call, quoting St. Paul, a stumbling block.
Mm-hmm.
So, in a way, I see with trigger warnings coming out of kind of online discourses, with feminism, and then kind of extending especially to gender studies classrooms, a sort of a community that is trying to preserve, is trying to kind of have standards of conversation and responsibility that look familiar to me from my own religious upbringing. So I don't know just what to make of that connection, but it's one thing that just struck me.
Yeah, I think so. Sort of bracketing my own opinion, which is that I think that they don't belong in the classroom, but they're not infantile. Like you see these kind of headlines, like today's college students demand to be swaddled up. I think people who advocate for things like trigger warnings are, in a sense, taking the effect of texts and objects of study more seriously than the people who blow them off. And I think that is like a commonality that it shares with the evangelical strain that you were talking about, and sort of stewardship of the eyes and stuff. Although that makes it, I think, another sort of key thing that is somewhat misunderstood when people are arguing about this is that on a syllabus, a request for a trigger warning isn't actually a request to avoid studying something, or it isn't most of the time, but just to be warned about it before encountering it. So the big thing that kicked this off last year was a student who approached a professor in, I think, a language class who had screened a film with, I guess, some kind of graphic scene in it. I don't know if it was a rape scene or just very violent. And I guess she had said something like that was inconsiderate. Maybe you should have warned us about it. And he kind of brushed her off, and then she retaliated in the only way that students do, I guess, by sort of protesting. And that was what started it the first time around. So you have a kind of an idea that students are supposed to encounter, especially artistic objects like Ovid or movies, that can affect them very viscerally, even if they haven't had traumatic experiences. And their reactions are not only, somebody who responds to Ovid by being disturbed is just wrong. Sort of like Jerry Coyne wrote a thing for the New Republic about this. It's kind of, life doesn't come with a trigger warning. You should be able to suck up and deal with these books. But that's sort of saying that a bad reaction can't be enlightening, or reveal something good about, not good, sorry, insightful about the book, or movie or whatever text is under discussion.
Right. Well, it just doesn't seem like a very that doesn't seem like much of a response from Coyne if he's just chiding people for being ninnies.
Yeah.
What if a book does have a powerful effect on you, you can't just kind of make fun of people for being, pearl clutchers or something. My own kind of feeling is that, it's worth looking at a broader, a longer history where, at one time, I think, a lot of content that's now given trigger warnings, I'm sure there are more absurd examples, but say a film where there's a graphic rape scene or something. A lot of this content just never would have been considered material fitting for discussion in a classroom or in other kind of, formal contexts, at one point in time. And there was a process of kind of fighting against those standards of saying, no, look, we can send, so for example, repealing the Comstock laws and saying, look, we can send material about sexual health in the mail, or we can send these art sketches via the mail. They're not, pornography. And then going beyond that and saying, well, there's no such thing as pornography. And when you have a kind of general, so it's sort of an interesting way in which the, probably, large swaths of, the feminist movement, along with many others, at one point for reasons of kind of educating women about sexual health would have been opposed to any restrictions on speech. I think for reasons that are coherent, given the commitments of people like Margaret Sanger and whatnot. Now maybe totally disparate strands of the feminist movement. I'm not trying to lump them all together. Per se, we're saying, well, we now do need some kind of care about speech, and so instead of restrictions on the front end that would have barred whole classes of speech or of content, so it would have been not just there wouldn't just have been trigger warnings. So instead of having trigger warnings over a rape scene at one point, you would have had a kind of social consensus that said there will be no sex scenes. So it's clearly going to exclude rape scenes, or you would have a cultural consensus against saying that violence is obscene, it needs to be off stage totally, and so then you wouldn't need trigger warnings related to certain kinds of violence. Say like racial violence, like a very graphic scene of a slave master whipping a slave or something. And so when you have there's what Rochelle Gerstein calls the repeal of reticence. In her book, she sketches out this process of kind of moving away from a regime where you're, keeping obscenity out of public view. Basically, we as a culture decided we don't want to do that, and now having made that decision, we're coming up against the hard fact that I think a regime of total kind of laissez-faire speech, it's no community is really going to be able to embrace that for long. There have to be, there's going to be some kind of limit. There's going to be some way of deciding what can and can't be said. And I think that we're kind of coming to this realization via trigger warnings. And I think simply ridiculing trigger warnings doesn't do enough to account for, the history of how we arrived at them and the way in which they express something kind of necessary and profound about being human, which is that, in certain contexts, there are certain things that can't be said, or they can't be said at least without certain introduction.
I think a lot of the kind of college social justice stuff, which I went to a college that was almost entirely apolitical, so this stuff is all, I read about it, but I never experienced any of it. But seems like an attempt to come up with a framework in which you can appeal to people to be kinder to you or to each other. But you can't make the appeal based on something like manners, because people sort of take that as a reason to be like edgier. So it has to be something like, well, you're re-traumatizing me, or you could be re-traumatizing somebody. and that's why you shouldn't say that, as opposed to like, that's just really poor taste, or it's like corrupting. But I also think something like Ovid, I mean, that would have been taught, or Don Giovanni, which is on the reading list at my undergraduate institution, is a kind of, every year really upsets somebody, because they're...
What text of Don Giovanni do you read? I've only seen
we do the opera,
but okay. You kind of view the opera somehow.
Yeah, so the college I went to, St. John's College, has no electives, all required. But there's a 2-year music component of the program, as it's called. And so you have 3 standalone sort of seminars on music that are not a part of the 2-year program, but that you're supposed to use the sort of knowledge of theory that you've gained. And one is on the St. Matthew Passion, and one is on Don Giovanni, and one is on Tristan and Isolde. And so with Don Giovanni, there's usually a screening of some video recording of the opera beforehand, but you go and do the class with the score. Obviously, actual music theory knowledge varies a lot, but there's usually a lot of disagreement over certain key scenes in the opera, whether Don Giovanni is a seducer or an attempted rapist. And these discussions are inevitably extremely upsetting. And I don't think that's bad. I mean, I think it's an upsetting opera, but it can be handled worse or better. But I guess I'm thinking, it certainly seems to me there are some things that, if you're just looking for a French film to screen in your film class, don't screen Irreversible, which is a famously graphic movie. Find something that's more mundane, where people can actually just focus on the French. And so, but if you're teaching a film class, you might have to teach a difficult movie, but you're hopefully teaching it to people who have the skills to understand why the movie is put together the way it is. But then there are sort of classic works that you want people to engage with, but which are by nature disturbing. And I think also, like Patient Griselda and the Canterbury Tales is another one. That story can be very upsetting to people. The Wife of Bath's Tale. But to me, is that I think it's actually, it's good to be provoked by these texts into having a strong reaction. The problem is when you're having, setting aside actual like PTSD triggers, which are a different kind of thing. If you're having a reaction in a situation where you either don't have the ability to express it intelligibly and can just say that you feel threatened or upset, or you don't have a situation where you can express it intelligibly and understand that you'll be met with any kind of sympathetic understanding, as opposed to get over it. The second of which I think, in the case of, say, my specific seminar on Don Giovanni, it was decided very early on in the seminar that a suggestion that Don Giovanni could be an attempted rapist simply wouldn't be entertained. It was sort of like a declarative statement made early on in the conversation that that was a theory that wasn't allowed in the conversation. And so that made the whole thing unnecessarily bad, because it was avoiding the uncomfortable subject instead of deciding that it needed to be discussed. I don't know if this distinction is making sense.
No, I mean that seems very odd to kind of say, well, we know at the end of the opera Don Giovanni will be damned to hell, but we're not going to discuss one of the main reasons he might have been.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah, you mentioned Canterbury Tales. I just recently read the Decameron, and I was, the subtitle of the book is, Galahalt, or um, which is a reference to the Divine Comedy, where Paolo and Francesca read a book that serves as a kind of Galahalt or go-between, and leads them into temptation and damnation. And so, um, you know, the Divine Comedy, we have this story of how a text, or how a work can cause great harm to individuals by depriving them of their eternal salvation. So Boccaccio kind of presents his book as precisely this.
Mm-hmm.
He does this ironically. It's an ironic response to Dante, who he greatly admired. And then in a postscript to the book, which is again very ironic, he says, I understand that this book, many of the stories herein and the stories in the Decameron are just wildly immoral at points, and there's all kinds of sex and sacrilege and other goings on that would draw the disapproval of pious Italians of the 14th century.
Mm-hmm.
And there are also many things that would draw the disapproval of so-called social justice warriors today.
Yeah, I've read it. It's kind of...
I hope everyone else. So yeah, and he kind of says in the postscript, look, I know, if you object to any of these tales, let me say that at the beginning of each tale, I have a very short description of what follows therein. So I put a warning at the beginning of each story, and I was really struck by his kind of defense. Like I let you know up front what was coming, and so in this kind of great, this kind of monumental work of literature, we have a kind of self-acknowledged trigger warning. But the differences, I think, still between kind of temptation and trauma are, the shift between the two. Those are profound. That's a profound change.
Yeah.
The kind of, it's less. The concern is less moral and more psychological. Certainly, and that's a large difference.
Yeah, and it's also, triggers, as discussed in the context of trigger warning, have only a slight relation to triggers as understood in the context of PTSD, or so is my understanding. Because I do actually have a few friends who have PTSD's triggers, and according to them, it can be almost anything that was sort of around whatever the traumatizing event was. So if there was a smell, it can be, but it's not as simple as this bad thing happened, and now whenever I see something that involves that bad thing, I get upset. But rather the smell of oranges makes me have an anxiety attack or something like that. So it's a kind of stretching of the concept of trauma past what it makes sense to be hurt by things, but it is a different thing from being traumatized. And this is still, that's still a separate thing from saying, well, if you're talking about something like, let's see, I guess I want to say there are times when you should be able to tell somebody, this thing that you're saying is morally corrupting of you, and it upsets me, but it's also bad for you to be saying these things. I guess something like a rape joke is kind of the example of this, or it's the example that I can think of right now, where it both upsets me, but is obviously coarsening to the other person. So you want to say something like, this is troublesome on two levels, and one is that you are hurting me, but the other is that you shouldn't be joking about this. But that second, the moral case that it's corrupting to you to approach this with humor seems to be harder to make.
Yeah, that's discredited, right?
Mm-hmm.
That kind of moral appeal to, you know, uh, kind of saying this is coarsening, or corrupting. That's pearl clutching, right? Or it's that's a bad thing, and probably in some kind of feminine way. It's school marmish or pearl clutching.
Yeah, I associate pearl clutching with like I associate that with offense. So it's not quite. It is
Okay.
school marmish, but it's like it's not quite. Oh, you like upset this uptight person.
Mm-hmm.
It's definitely as you know because you know me. It's definitely puritanical, which is my favorite reappropriated insult.
Wait, what do you mean?
Well, I mean it's
Why is that a good thing? I'm a Catholic, so of course I'm horrified by the idea of Puritanism.
right.
Because Catholics and Puritans were historically great antagonists.
So
what is this attempted reappropriation?
Right. I think that partly I think puritanical is part of a class of words, all of which are used to insult you for having some kind of moral approach to an issue. So uptight is another one. I don't know what is there like I can't think of a specifically Catholic equivalent here, but so it's partly that I think usually accusations of Puritanism are a self-compliment because they're saying, oh, you have like standards which you aren't afraid to project out into the world. But I think also Perry Miller, in one of his collection of the Puritan writings, Perry Miller was a kind of famous scholar of the American Puritans, and did a lot of work to rehabilitate their reputation. Talks about how the main thing that distinguished a Puritan from a member of the Church of England was this viewing every choice as a thing where there was a moral and immoral option. So there's a moral choice in every aspect of your life, which could easily devolve into a sort of self-parody where like are wigs moral or immoral? Or I think the example he gives in the introduction is also seeing like the workings of God and everything can become absurd if you write this about everything. So that I saw the workings of God when I fed my chicken today. This mud puddle I fell into, and that kind of thing. But even though it can become sort of comical, it still seems like a noble, if exhausting, way to live. Sort of looking for, what is the choice that I can make in any situation that is ultimately ennobling or corrupting here? What's the kind of transcendent aspect of this thing that I'm looking at?
My feeling is that sorry to jump in. This is something that is very familiar to me. If you read, John Henry Newman, the Anglican, the great Anglican who became a great Catholic. If you read his parochial and plain sermons, there's also this idea of every moment of life being charged with a kind of moral, immediacy of choice, and you can see this working itself out in like the poetry of Gerard Manley Hopkins. So seeing the divine kind of aspect of everything in life can lead to work of great beauty also.
Yeah. The Puritans did not produce Gerard Manley Hopkins, alas, but they did produce some good poetry and Bradstreet. Some other good writers. But in any case, how did we get off on this? Oh
Well,
yeah.
you mentioned Puritanism, but I think it's worth, and so you think that we should rehabilitate that word Puritan. I kind of wanted to get from you sort of, why you think it's worth vindicating this. Now, it seems to me that, Puritan really became an insult with Mencken writing
Yeah.
his, his sort of snarly columns, and what Rochelle Gerstein says in her book is that, Mencken's she calls it Puritan baiting. His Puritan
Mhm.
baiting isn't, like his criticism as a whole is not so much a uh, consistent position as a sort of instinct to pull down and a sort of way of asserting his own judgments, because Mencken was not averse, obviously, to making strong judgments, to sort of asserting the one's own individual judgments against maybe a broad social consensus. Maybe that's what, what's going on when we kind of decry Puritanism. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think. I mean, now there, aside from like, ultra contrarians like me, I don't think there are many people who would. If Puritanism represents a idea of consensus, it's obviously a consensus that doesn't actually exist, right? Um, it's sort of like a bogeyman
But I
consensus.
think it's notionally, the idea is sort of that, well, it's collective. Puritanism kind of, it indicates some kind of stodgy, maybe
Mm-hmm.
collective, maybe traditional opinion, even if no one really holds it anymore.
Right.
It's that kind of mass thing that the free individual has to kick against somehow.
Yeah.
I
Well,
think that's important to the use of the term, even if there are no Puritans left.
yeah. I guess I'm also so the other two American artifacts that continue to do damage to puritanical reputations are the Scarlet Letter and the Crucible. Um, and they also sort of present the Puritans as like inflexible and corrupt society um, that the truly noble people have to define themselves against. Um,
Right.
it's not just their rigid morality.
Yeah, that's a good point. These were parables speaking about a different time. Also,
Yeah, though in the case of the Crucible, I mean, the Puritans were all dead by then too.
right.
I did actually read an article once, I think in the Believer, that was talking about Puritan New England, and it cited two texts, and one was the Scarlet Letter, and the other was the Crucible, which I found really funny. Um, I didn't actually read the rest of it. It was just like those were its 2 points for understanding Puritanism. But it was making a historical argument about like lingering effects of Puritanism. It wasn't just like the Puritan and the American imagination. Um, but yeah, so I guess when I read something that's like, oh, puritanical critics of um, Game of Thrones or puritanical feminists or puritanical this, I don't know if they are. I'm trying to think if I sense the idea of consensus in there. I guess there must be some degree of that because the person who is calling people Puritans obviously wants to feel both as if they are very like they, the accuser, are very like comfortably mainstream but still edgy. It's kind of having it both ways. Like I'm on the winning side, but I'm also a little edgy. Um, I don't
It
know.
sounds good to me. That's where I'd like to be. You know.
Yeah, kind of a. I think yeah, it's a nice fantasy to be both provocative but secure. Um, but yeah, so I guess we were discussing this because of the word corrupting,
Mm-hmm.
like something being corrupting to the person speaking as opposed to triggering to the person hearing it. Uh, yeah, I can't actually. I don't know if I've actually ever said that to anybody. Like you're debasing yourself by saying this or hurting yourself. even though I do think that sometimes about people, so maybe I should. Again.
Yeah, you can say to me at least.
Yeah.
I'll authorize you now. So, what if we shift gears a little bit?
That sounds fine.
You recently wrote an interesting article about tipping,
Oh, yeah.
tipping for services, what have you, and you talked about Trotsky's approach to tipping. Was it Trotsky?
Yeah, it's Trotsky.
I knew it was some red. Um, so, how did you end up on this topic? I mean, to me, tipping is just an aspect of life. I don't think it had really occurred to me to kind of look into the origins of tipping or ask what was behind it. It's just sort of a fact.
Yeah, so the sort of the reason I got kind of obsessed with the question of tipping was because I worked for a year in a coffee/muffin store, and we didn't have tips for the first half of that year, and then we had them for the second half. And the transformation that it sort of, for the worse, in just about every aspect of customer relations was amazing. And before we had it, occasionally people would just get extremely upset that they couldn't tip. And usually they were kind people. But it was kind of funny, like they would hide money. Like it was just uncomfortable to them, even though they knew that we were not being paid the tip wage, we're earning, I guess, minimum wage, or I was in Maryland. But anyway, then the tip jar came in, and people would undertip you for not laughing or responding quickly enough to like sort of chatty questions. I had one woman who tried to pay for part of her meal using the tip jar. She had a big bill that she didn't want to break, and she didn't feel like using her credit card. I mean, this is like literally what happened. So she just pulled money out of the tip jar and tried to pay with it. So that was the beginning of my interest in this, because it was sort of clear that this was an institution that made people worse, or at least from my personal experience. So then I started looking into wider discussions of tipping. And it's interesting, in part, there are a lot of weird urban legends about tipping, the main one being that there were jars on the counters of, say, English pubs that said "to ensure prompt service," and that's where you get the phrase tips from. And so, sort of in that folk history of tipping has always been this kind of bribe that shiftless wait people are using to just like extract extra money from you. It looks like it actually began as a practice of having to give money to your friend's servants when you stayed at their home to compensate them for the extra work, which apparently those were called veils. And apparently they became so exorbitant that people stopped visiting each other because the amount of money they had to pay to servants was too high. But it's a slightly different thing from, say, an open bribe. But there are also
so if I were a kind of cheap lord, I would just underpay my servants and invite many of my friends over.
Yeah.
Okay.
You can try that strategy now if you want to.
I'm currently looking for servants, but no one is I'm offering rates that don't seem competitive.
Yeah. Well, you could pretend to have servants, which your guests never see. Yeah. Then there's also some sort of social science around tipping that seems to indicate, at least in dining, it doesn't actually make service better. Mm-hmm. And some evidence indicates that most people tip exactly the same amount, or same percentage, whether the service they receive is good or bad. Which sort of, that fits with my anecdotal experience.
I
But
think
I don't.
that's basically what I do.
Yeah,
Unless the service is really disastrous, but I still feel bound to tip within a certain range because it's like part of their wage or something. I don't know. But yeah, I can't say that I put any effort into adjusting the tip for better or worse service
yeah.
for my own part.
I've only ever adjusted it when the I knew the wait staff were dealing with some kind of ongoing disaster while they were serving me. Um, and so then I would tip more. But I have occasionally gotten pretty bad service, but I've never felt like it was bad enough to tip less, and I'm not really sure what would be bad enough. But yeah, so it's this kind of odd institution where most people just tip a flat amount. It doesn't really matter. And then for some people, it's this like complete power trip. And probably for some people, it is without them quite knowing it. Like this one study from, I think, the late 80s or the early 90s, that was incompetent but attractive waitresses earned the most in tips from, I think, male patrons because the patrons could feel bad for them. So, and unattractive waitresses were tipped the least, but an attractive but competent waitress was not as interesting to somebody dining as somebody who was making mistakes all the time. So it's this kind of weird desire to feel superiority. The one trouble, both with the article and with my research in general, is that obviously tipping actually extends beyond dining, right? There's tipping in hotel services and haircutting and all that kind of stuff. And there's not as much information out there about it, I think, because it's not as normal a thing for people to do. Most people have an experience either working in a coffee shop like I did or working as a waiter or a waitress. And they get to know what that's like and develop an opinion about it. But most people don't have a stint as a hairdresser. So whether hairdressers are sort of negatively affected or whether incompetent but attractive hairdressers get better tips, that would be hard for me to believe. But, that kind of stuff is sort of understudied. Yeah, so the conclusion I had in the article was that tipping is corrosive because Americans can't respect the idea of service as a vocation or a profession. So you have to try and recast what the other person is doing as something other than like a job that has professional standards. It's like, oh, they're doing it because they like me, and they like me because I'm really generous. Or they're doing it because you get lots of fabulous money under the table through wait staff work. But it's not like a way of controlling quality or recognizing quality, and it doesn't actually improve service, so it should just be ended. However, people have been trying to do this since the early 1900s, and trying to kill tipping, and it hasn't happened yet. So I'm doubtful that I will be the one to drive the nail into the coffin. But yeah, I don't. Do you have any? Have you ever worked as a waiter?
You're still tipping. You're still tipping.
Yeah. Unlike Trotsky, who refused to tip, I still tip. So I do like the the stories about these people who printed out little cards that they would leave instead of a tip that said, you shouldn't have to be tipped. Your employer should be paying you fair wages. please present this card to your employer, which seems almost worse than just not tipping at all. Like, instead of getting money, you get this little lecture. But yeah, no, I would continue tipping, though I don't know if I would if I went to, say, Seattle, where I knew that waiters and waitresses are getting paid minimum wage, which is pretty high there, I think. But I've never been to Seattle, so this has never come up. But I was going to ask, do you have any experience? I mean, were you ever a waiter or worked in a coffee shop or had some kind of service job?
No, I've never worked a tipped job. So being on, I've only ever tipped, I guess. I think the closest I ever came to something like this, I remember once I was a little kid and I was on the swim team in town, and we had to sell shampoo to raise money for the swim team, and I remember some old couple bought a bottle of shampoo from me. You're going door to door in a town selling this stuff, and then this guy gave me like 75 cents and told me to buy myself a Coke and a hot dog. Or maybe it was like 50 cents. It was something. And I don't think, I guess that's not tipping, but he just sort of, it was this kind of moment of kind of, pity and like attempted generosity. That was very charming, but totally out of touch with economic reality. I was not able to get a Coke and hot dog.
Yeah, were you able to get anything?
I think I could like afford a sucker, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, 75 cents might get you like a pack of gum, but 50 cents I don't think gets you anything.
Yeah. But no, I know very little about it from that end.
But yeah, well, the other fun thing about researching the history of tipping is just discovering the various organizations that have been dedicated to the end of tipping. There used to be an organization called the Society for the Prevention of Useless Giving. And its main, so they went by the acronym SPUGS. And their main enemy was Christmas. They sold special Christmas cards that said, "I'm not giving you a Christmas present," because it's like a useless gift that you don't need. And people shouldn't give gifts for no reason. But they were also opposed to tipping. But it's also like the history of tipping is a history of weird American social movements. Yeah.
Where did the Puritans stand on tipping?
I don't.
Was it a feature of Puritan society?
This I do not know. I do know the Puritans were opposed to Christmas, so it would stand to reason that they were also opposed to tipping.
Right.
If we project the SPUGS backward.
Yeah, I think I'm going to take a kind of middle. I'm going to kind of split the baby, pro-Christmas, anti-tipping.
Yeah, that's about where I land too.
Yeah. I think this is a moderate vision for America's future.
Yeah, pro-Christmas, anti-tipping.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, more gifts that are actually gifts. Fewer strange fake gifts. Society.
Right. So you mentioned that tipping. So this is something important. Like tipping, it's kind of about there's at least a sort of pretense of it becomes by making a certain part of the exchange voluntary and adjustable, or at least voluntary, notionally,
Mm-hmm.
even if the server would run out and find you if you didn't actually tip. You thought that kind of makes it seem, generous or gift-like.
Mm-hmm.
I know in a recent papal encyclical, Caritas in Veritate, Pope Benedict XVI called for more of a kind of a higher, what he called in typical awkward Vatican speak, a higher quotient of gratuity in the economy, which I think are more like logic of gifts.
Mm-hmm.
And I never quite know what statements like this mean. But from our conversation, I'm thinking that we should not construe it to mean more tipping.
Yeah, I would have to. I'm extremely poorly placed to try and interpret Benedict's statement, but I think the defining feature of a gift, right, is that the defining feature of a gift to me is that it doesn't come with an expectation of anything, right? It's just pure generosity.
Right. And even if
not a
gifts
reward.
anthropologically don't work that way, that's very important to how we understand them and why we value them, right?
Right.
We do what we can to kind of conceal direct reciprocity in
Right.
gift exchanges. Yeah.
I think that's why people like getting presents, but they hate getting Christmas cards, right? Because Christmas cards demand to be reciprocal. So if
Right.
you get a card from somebody you didn't send a card to. Whereas a present is kind of nice. You're like, oh, this person liked me more than I thought. But yeah. Well, maybe we can ask Bernie Sanders to add this to his presidential campaign. The end of tipping.
Yeah, that's. I mean, it's the kind of thing he might be up for, right?
Yeah. I don't know if that would play well with the youth vote or not. I assume that if it came with a rise in the minimum wage, it would play well. But who knows?
Right. Yeah, I haven't followed the Bernie Sanders candidacy in any great detail, but I imagine it'll be a healthy one for the Democratic Party and the political process as a whole. Which is also my feeling about Rand Paul's candidacy. I'm, without being a Rand Paulite, it's nice to have, a different view in the mix, I think.
Yeah, one thing I was actually I was reading today is that Bernie Sanders was trying to get a cross-party debate. So Democrat candidates and Republican candidates debating each other before the end of the primaries, which I think could have been pretty interesting because then you would have people who are not sort of pure election bots talking to each other. But as it is, I guess if we're lucky, we'll get to see him debate Hillary Clinton and Martin O'Malley. And that'll be it. But
yeah, I'm just looking at the prospect of a Clinton candidacy, or the reality of a Clinton candidacy and the prospect of a Clinton presidency with such dread. I think in no small part because I'm a rabid right winger, but also just the kind of corporate, monolithic kind of, and unapologetically kind of slimy and self-dealing nature of the Clinton machine. It's odd. I feel like they're political people or journalists, maybe a generation older than us, had to deal with this once, and I never really, I was young enough, I didn't really have any firm read on who the Clintons were, and there's this odd feeling that something I was able to avoid once, I might now have to encounter in its second iteration. So
yeah, well,
maybe it's the punishment we deserve.
Yeah, I was gonna say, even not thinking about the Clinton presidency, but just the Clinton-Bush presidential race is a thoroughly depressing just thinking about it makes me want to sleep through 2016. But oh well.
Well, I think that with that's a kind of nice despairing note to
On
end
that
on.
bright note.
Yeah. So, but we should still, I think, kind of account for what we've gained or what we've been able to establish during the course of this conversation, so that people um, kind of know what the new dispensation is. But I think we've established that there will be no tipping
Yeah.
in tomorrow's America. That Puritanism is good.
Yes.
That what about trigger warnings? What are we saying about that?
I think we're saying that they are a bad solution to a real phenomenon.
Yeah.
I think
Yes.
the answer is better pedagogy.
The answer is better pedagogy. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the definitive interpretation of Don Giovanni in Tomorrow's America is that Don Giovanni is an attempted rapist. That I feel fairly confident about.
Yeah, I don't. Parenthetically, I don't remember the libretto in any detail, but he's supposed to be a very bad character. I think. I think obviously questions of staging come in. So I don't know how, if the libretto is not decisive, maybe it depends on kind of how it's presented. I had a drama professor who once told me the correct reading is the most interesting reading, and I don't think a performance of Don Giovanni that heightens the moral drama would be a bad one.
Yeah, so I think Don Giovanni has a number of encounters with women throughout the opera, all of which he fails at, and many of which are somewhat coercive, or at least deceptive. Right. The big one under dispute is his run-in with Donna Anna at the beginning, where he's running away and she's dragging him back, and it's not clear if she's dragging him back because she wants to bring him to justice or because she doesn't want him to leave. But I think, to go with your drama professor's comment, there is already a woman in the opera who pursues Don Giovanni because he slept with her and then spurned her. And it would be strange for Mozart to write the same character twice in an opera, to me. I mean, then I don't know why you would have... This is Donna Elvira is the other one. I don't know why you would have them both. But in my experience, there's a kind of young person, not exclusively male, who responds to Don Giovanni with this kind of like, oh, wow, this guy is so great. He's like above conventional morality. He's basically a god. But for some reason, being above conventional morality doesn't encompass... it encompasses like murder, but not rape. So they're not willing to... Yeah.
Murder and seduction are on the table.
Yeah.
But not... Yeah. So I guess there's a lack of commitment to
being above conventional morality.
Right. And I don't know if, I don't, years ago I read Kierkegaard's treatment of this in Either Or, where I think his, whatever the name of his character is, the kind of aesthetic character, thrills to listening to Don Giovanni. That's kind of one of the inspirations for his aesthetic approach to life. Anyway, that appreciation is presented ironically within the structure of the book. It's kind of contrasted with the ethical approach, and so I suppose the burden of that aesthetic approach is trying to aestheticize something like rape, which to me seems a rather tall order.
Yeah. But, all right, well, I hope you have a good evening.
Barbara, thanks for talking.
Thank you.
Yep.
Bye.